Chapter 10 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Barefaced Robbery in the Maine Woods. 3 men were bending over the dead deer, and all of them carried rifles. They were a rough-looking set, all told, and anyone would know at a glance that they could not be city sportsmen up here in the Maine woods on a hunt, but must belong to the native class of guides, loggers, or possibly something worse. One of them was in truth a giant, and as soon as Thad set eyes on this individual he knew that his worst fears were about to be realized. This could be no other than the big poacher, Old Cale Martin, the man whom the game wardens seemed to dread like poison, and had never yet dared arrest, though his breaking of the laws had become notorious all through that section where he roamed. Despite his sensation of acute alarm, Thad surveyed the man with more or less interest and curiosity. He had heard so much about his doings that he would have actually felt a certain degree of disappointment had he gone away from Maine and never met Cale Martin. Then what Jim Hasty had told him added to his desire to look upon the face of Little Lena's awful father. No doubt Step Hen must also have jumped at some sort of right conclusion with regard to the identity of the 3 men. The unusual size of the leader was quite enough in itself to tell who they must be. Thad did not halt long upon sighting the others, but walked forward. Even though poachers, this did not mean that the 3 men were desperate outlaws by any means. No doubt they walked in and out of villages in this extreme northern section of the state, and were greeted by those who knew them as fellow guides, though seldom were any of them employed in such a capacity nowadays. Step Hen tagged at the heels of his chum. He did not know what Thad might be going to do, but although white of face just then, with a sudden fear of trouble, at least Step Hen showed no sign of running away. The 3 men looked up as the boys approached. All of them seemed to be grinning, as though amused. But while the big man really looked somewhat as a mastiff might appear to a little terrier, his 2 companions had a sneer on their dark, evil faces that gave Thad more or less uneasiness. He knew that while Step Hen was entitled to that fine buck, the chances were his claim would never be considered for a single minute. Might made right in the Maine woods, with men of this stamp. "Hello, younkers, lookin' arter your deer, eh?" remarked the giant, as the boys boldly approached. "Wall, thar hain't any, d'ye see. We got a fine leetle buck here as Si fetched down with his big bore cannon; only fur him the deer's been in ther next county afore now, eh, Si?" And the giant, as he said this, turned on the man who wore the greasy suit of buckskin, and sported a coonskin cap, after the style of the old time hunters now so nearly extinct. "Thet's right, Cale. He'd a been agoin' like 240 yet, an' only for the ounce of lead I throwed into him on the jump. I guess as haow that leetle pepper box jest tickled him a mite, an' made him feel frisky. Step right up an' take a look at my buck, if so be yer wanter, strangers. I hain't begrudgin' you that much conserlation. But don't you be sayin' you had any hand in knockin' him over, 'cause I don't stand for any foolishness, see?" He looked particularly ugly when saying this last, and Thad knew there was not the slightest shadow of a chance that they would get justice from these fellows. Seeing the sadly wounded deer plunging blindly toward them, Si had fired at the animal, and now they claimed to own the prize. Well, there was no use trying to make a fuss over it. 2 boys could hardly expect to overawe 3 such hardened woods rangers as these. Nevertheless, for his own satisfaction, Thad accepted the rude invitation of Si Kedge to advance closer, so that he could stand over the deer. Something caught his eye as he looked, and bending down, he deftly took the object from the motionless body of the deer, just back of the shoulder where a patch of blood appeared. Thad held the object up so that all could see. Even Step Hen recognized it as the mushroomed bullet that had been fired from his rifle. The evidence was as positive and clear as noonday, for that bullet, after spreading out, had bored completely through the body of the buck, and was ready to drop from the other side when it caught the sharp eye of Thad. And that other wound in the neck must have been where the boasted large caliber bullet from Si's big gun had gone, producing only a superficial hurt that would not have seriously inconvenienced the sturdy buck. "Oh, that's my bullet!" exclaimed Step Hen, hardly comprehending what a storm his words might bring about their ears. "And just as you said, Thad, I hit him in the side where his heart lies. That would have killed him in a short time, I just guess, don't you, Thad?" But Thad did not make any answer. He was keeping his eyes on the three men, even while dropping the spread out bullet into his pocket to show it to Eli and Jim and Allan when they returned to camp, as proof that the glory of killing the fine 6-pronged buck really belonged to Step Hen. The giant actually gave a little chuckle. Evidently he admired the nerve shown by this half grown lad; for like most big men, Cale Martin could on occasion exhibit a sense of generosity toward those smaller than himself. With just that brief chance to see what the three poachers looked like, Thad was able to size them up along different lines. He believed that Si and Ed were both shallow-brained bullies, with revengeful natures; but that Cale Martin, while known as a desperate man, was really more so through his association with such rascals as these than for any other cause. And Thad chanced to know just why he had doubly earned this reputation for ugliness during the last year or so. Jim Hasty's running away with his little girl Lina had been the last straw that broke the camel's back, since it had made Old Cale feel reckless, and as though he cared no longer for anything in this world. "What d'ye think of that, Si?" burst out the other fellow, who had not spoken up to now. "The pesky critter is a-claimin' as how his friend sent that bullet through their buck's ribs, when we all know 'twar from your gun." The shorter poacher gritted his teeth, and looked daggers at Thad. He even made a significant movement with his heavy rifle, which the boy saw was of the repeating pattern, and had the hammer raised at that moment. "I don't stand for any sech talk as that," he declared, with savage energy. "And if their cubs knows what is good for 'em, they'll turn tail, and mosey outen this here region some quick. Scat now, and be mighty keerful how you start to claimin' a deer agin, what another man's shot. It's somethin' that ain't goin' ter be allowed up here in the woods. I gives you fair warnin' tew change base, and clar out." "Come on, Thad, let's move along," exclaimed Step Hen, who was white in the face, and trembling more or less. Of course the patrol leader was far too smart to think of trying to defy that ugly lot. At the same time Thad showed no sign of fear as he turned and gave the bully of the woods one sneering look, as though plainly telling him what he thought. Indeed, it seemed to stir the ire of the man who claimed to have killed the deer, for with a snort he started to throw up his gun, as if bent on threatening mischief, unless the boys ran in a hurry. But it was the hand of the giant that grasped the gun, and turned it aside. "Don't you try it, Si!" roared Old Cale. "We done enough as 'tis, takin' their game away from 'em, without layin' a hand on their hides. But you'd better skip out, as Si says, younkers. And say, while I think o' it, just tell that sneak, Jim Hasty, fur me, that I'm goin' to keep my word about them ears o' his'n. I'll learn him what it means ter defy Old Cale Martin." For the life of him Thad could not help making some sort of reply to this. "I'll carry your message, just as you say," he went on; "but let me tell you right here and now, you never made a bigger mistake in your life when you called Jim Hasty a sneak or a coward. Would a coward dare come up here when he knew how you hated him, and had it in for him? I guess not much. Fact is, Jim's got a message for you. Somebody's sent him up here. And he meant to hunt you up and see you face to face. A coward? Well, I guess not." And without giving the giant a chance to say another word, Thad wheeled, striding away, with the nervous Step Hen at his side, casting many an anxious glance back over his shoulder, as though not quite convinced that the warlike Si might not think it best after all to shoot after them. But 10 minutes later, and the two boys were well away from the spot, which had come very near looking upon a tragedy. "How do you feel about it now?" asked Thad. "What d'ye mean?" inquired the other. "I'm as sore as can be about losing my lovely 6-pronged buck, and knocked over all by myself, too. Wouldn't I just like to give it to that low down liar of a Si Kedge, though, for saying that was his bullet, when anybody could see that it came from my rifle? Why, he only pinked the deer in the neck, because I could see the mark. Oh, the thieves, the miserable skunks, to cheat me out of my prize. I'll never, never get over this, Thad." "Oh, yes, you will, Step Hen," remarked the other soothingly, for he felt that the bare faced robbery had been a terrible shock to his companion. But what I meant when I asked that was, do you want to head toward camp now? Have you had enough hunting for today?" "Now, I know you're saying that, Thad, just to let me down easy," declared the other. "I acknowledge that I was beginning to get tired, up to the time I killed that deer, but it's all passed away now. The excitement did it for me, and I've got my second wind." "Then you want to keep on hunting?" asked the scoutmaster, feeling that Step Hen was exhibiting considerable grit under the circumstances, and delighted to see the same brought out by the ill turn fortune had given him. "Sure I do," instantly replied the other. "I'm just wild to get another chance to knock over a 6-pronged buck, and now that I know the ropes, it's easy as falling off a log. Looks like this snow ain't agoin' to amount to much, after all, and we've got pretty nearly half a day ahead of us yet, so let's keep on for a while. When I get a little tired we'll stop to eat our snack of grub, when I can rest up, and be ready for another hour or two. But I'm afraid my luck has turned, and we won't sight another deer this blessed day. Do you, Thad?" "We'll hope to, at any rate," replied the other, as he started off again. "And it's that constant expectation of starting up game that makes hunting all it's cracked up to be. So come along, Step Hen, and if we fail to bring in our share of venison it won't be because we lay down too easy. Now for quiet again, remember, and keep a constant lookout ahead." End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of the Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Overtaken by darkness. It must have been a long time after the noon hour when Step Hen did as he had promised, called a halt in order that they might eat their lunch and take a rest. As the cold was still with them, though the snow had thus far amounted to but little, Step Hen insisted on starting a small fire at which they could sit and be comfortable, while they devoured the food provided for the midday meal. "You make a fire as quick as the next one, Step Hen," admitted Thad, really meaning what he said, and at the same time wishing to raise the drooping spirits of his hunting mate, who was feeling very sore over the loss of his game. "Oh, I don't pretend to know much about starting a blaze in half a dozen styles, the way Giraffe's got it down pat," observed the other, smiling a little; "but if you pin me down to going at it the easiest way, with matches, and dead pine cones, why, I'm there every time. And say, it does feel some handy, don't it, Thad?" They sat there and chatted for quite a long time after they had consumed the last morsel of food; and during that resting spell Step Hen picked up many a crumb of useful knowledge concerning the ways of the woods. Thad did not know all that Allan Hollister had learned through practical experience, but he had made the most of his opportunities when belonging to that other troop of scouts, and never forgot what he learned. "Let's be going on again," remarked Step Hen finally, scrambling to his feet, and picking up his little rifle with a new eagerness. "Feel like another spell of it, eh?" asked the patrol leader, following suit. "That's what I do," replied the other. "Nothin' like a rest and a bite when you're pretty near played out. I'm feeling fine and dandy again, and ready for several hours' hard tramping. But something just seems to tell me we'll never again have such a chance to get a 6-pronged buck as that. And to think how it should have been just what the boys were tellin' me to knock over. I wonder now—" "What?" asked Thad, as his chum came to a sudden stop. "Perhaps you'll say I'm silly if I tell you, but anyhow here goes, Thad. It just struck me all of a sudden that we might go back to where we lost our deer, and do a little trailing on our own account. Them 3 fellers wouldn't bother trying to hide their tracks, and chances are they've gone into camp to eat some of that venison by this time, if not sooner." Thad smiled. He could not help it upon hearing Step Hen talk in this strain; for only too plainly did he remember how white the other had been, and how even his voice trembled when he spoke while facing those 3 poachers. "And after we've managed to track them to their camp, what then?" he demanded. Step Hen looked wonderfully brave as he instantly replied: "Why, we might catch 'em off their guard, and hold 'em up. That deer belongs to me, and I'd just like to have it the worst kind, especially that head with the 6-pronged antlers on it. But if you thought that proposition a little too risky, Thad, why, we might conclude to wait around, keeping under cover till it got plumb dark. Then we could carry off as much of the buck as we could tote, including the head; and them fellers not be any the wiser for it, till it was too late to follow us. How's that?" Thad nearly had his breath taken away by the boldness of Step Hen's astonishing proposals. He looked at the other, and a smile spread completely across his face. Then he puckered up his lips, and gave a little whistle that somehow caused Step Hen to turn a bit red in the face. "Whew!" ejaculated Thad. "I never before suspected what a fire eater you could be, Step Hen. Why, nothing phases you nowadays. I believe you'd be ready to snap your fingers in the faces of a dozen of the worst rascals that ever hid up here in the piney woods of Maine. But I'm afraid that's too risky a job for me to back up, as the leader of the patrol. I feel the burden of responsibility too much to allow it. What could I say to your father and mother if there was no Step Hen to answer to the roll call, when we mustered out after this Maine hunt? So, on the whole, Step Hen, much as I hate to disappoint you, I'm afraid I'll have to put a damper on your scheme." "Oh! all right, Thad," quickly remarked the other, with an evident vein of relief in his voice. "I was only tellin' you what came into my head. You see, that's the way with me. I'm always having these brilliant plans, though my own good sense won't let me try to carry them out. So we'll just continue our old hunt, and hope another buck may heave in sight. But if one does, please let fly the same time I shoot, Thad, because we hadn't ought to take any chances of his getting away. You will, won't you, Thad?" "Why, yes, I think I'm entitled to a shot by now, Step Hen," replied the other, "seeing that I held back purposely so as to let you have all the glory of getting that first prize. But as you say, we need venison, and the next time we'll shoot together so's to make sure." "Good! Then let's be moving, Thad." Since Step Hen was so set upon doing everything in their power to retrieve the misfortune that had come upon them earlier in the day, by means of which they had lost the first deer, Thad meant to try his level best in order to run across another like prize. Whenever he saw a piece of ground that looked more than ordinarily promising, he would head that way, regardless of distance or direction. Little Thad cared as to whether they were able to return to camp that night or not. He had spent too many nights in the open not to feel certain that he could manage to be at least fairly comfortable. And then, too, Thad had the hunter's instinct pretty fully developed, and thought little of fatigue when pursuing his favorite sport. They kept moving in this way until the afternoon began to be pretty well spent. Thad would not think of offering again to head toward the camp on the shore of the lake, so long as Step Hen made no complaint. He could not afford to be outdone by a tenderfoot, and he the patrol leader at that. Indeed, the gray of evening had commenced to spread around them, when, with no more warning than before, they came upon a second buck that had possibly been lying down in the bushes. The deer sprang away like lightning, and perhaps it was just as well that Step Hen had asked his companion to shoot with him, for the flitting buck made rather a difficult target to hit in that poor light. So close together did the two lads fire that the reports blended, though the louder bang of the smooth bore partly drowned the sharper report of the little repeating rifle. Thad started to run forward, holding his gun in readiness for a second discharge if such were needed. Step Hen trailed along after him, working desperately with his pump gun, and like most excitable greenhorns, trying every which way to work the simple mechanism but the right way, in his eagerness to get the weapon in serviceable condition again. "Oh! did we get him, Thad?" he cried, for possibly the smoke of the double discharge had interfered with his vision, and he did not know whether the deer had dropped, or sped unharmed out of sight, even before the alert Thad could give him the contents of his second barrel. "Looks like we'll have venison for supper tonight, anyway," laughed Thad. And then Step Hen, looking more closely ahead, saw a slight movement on the ground, which he realized must be the last expiring kick of their quarry. His spirits arose at once, and he gave a wild whoop of joy. "Bully! Bully!" he exclaimed, as he still ran forward after his chum. "We did get him all right, didn't we, Thad? And I'd just like to see any woods thief try to hook this deer away from us. Don't you let him do it, Thad, will you, even if we have to fight for it?" "Don't worry," said Thad, as they came to a halt over the fallen buck. "We're not going to have any trouble, not from that source, anyway." If Step Hen had been less excited, he might have noticed that the words of his companion seemed to admit of their having trouble of another kind; but just then the tenderfoot was too much wrapped up in other things. "Oh! that's too bad, Thad," he remarked. "What is?" asked the other. "Both of us hit him, all right, for there's the place your bullet went in, and these smaller holes show where my buckshot struck." "But look at his antlers, would you, Thad?" the other went on. "Why, this is only a 2-year-old, I sure reckon, because he's only got 2 prongs on his horns." "Well, so much the better for us when we start to eat 'em," chuckled Thad, "because the meat'll be just that much more tender, you see." "Then let's get busy and cut 'em up, Thad," Step Hen went on. "Seems to me night's coming right along down on us, and the chances are we'll be awful late getting back to camp." What Thad really thought he did not take the trouble to mention; but no doubt he had long before then made up his mind that they would never make camp that evening, for he felt that Step Hen must be nearly all in. He did start to work, however, and with the other to assist in various ways, managed to get the deer cut up after a fashion. The meat they expected to carry with them, together with the head, which Step Hen would not think of leaving behind, was made up into 2 packs, so that each of them might carry a fair portion. By that time it was pitch dark. Indeed, Step Hen had to kindle another little fire of dry pine cones in order that the operation of getting the meat secured might be brought to a finish. "Wow! Just look how dark it is!" exclaimed Step Hen, when finally Thad announced that he was ready to go on, after getting his bearings, which he did easily by sighting the North Star, the clouds having very conveniently disappeared, and all present danger of a heavy snowfall vanishing with their going. Step Hen was rather slow and clumsy about getting his load fastened, and Thad had to assist him. He knew full well what was the matter. The other was really dead tired, and could hardly put one foot before the other without a great effort. He had been artificially kept up by the excitement until the game was secured, and now the reaction was setting in. They had been slowly moving along for about 10 minutes, when from a little distance away there broke out a strange sound, that heard under those peculiar conditions struck Step Hen as more blood-curdling than he had ever thought it before, when sitting safely in a camp beside a cozy fire, and surrounded by comrades. It was that same long-drawn howl of the Canada gray wolf; and as he listened to a second answering cry from another quarter, somehow Step Hen found himself shuddering. CHAPter 11. Chapter 12 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Brought to bay by wolves. "Oh, how awfully queer them howls seem, Thad," remarked Step Hen presently, just as the patrol leader expected he would; for he had a pretty good idea as to what was just passing in the mind of the tenderfoot. "Well, they do sound different somehow, from what they did when we were sitting around the cheery camp fire, listening to stories told by the guides," Thad admitted. "But then, wolves as a rule are cowardly brutes. They may do a heap of howling, but they seldom show any bravery. Only when in packs are they feared by hunters, away up in the frozen up parts of Canada, I'm told." "But say, don't you think there's a pack around here right now?" demanded Step Hen, apprehensively. "What makes you ask that?" the other questioned. "Why, in the first place, old Eli told us they never came away down here unless in numbers; and then again, Thad, didn't you notice that when one gave tongue over yonder to the right, a second answered him back from the left; and by jinks! Listen to that, would you? A third and a fourth, as sure as you live. Say, they're all around us, Thad. They've got us surrounded." "Let 'em surround, if it does 'em any good," laughed the other; and if he felt the slightest bit of uneasiness himself on account of those wolfish howls, Thad at least managed to conceal it, because he knew Step Hen was feeling creepy enough as it was, without having his alarm augmented by seeing his companion concerned. "But don't you think they might be able to pull us down just by force of numbers, Thad?" the other went on. "Oh! there can't be any such bunch of the cowardly brutes around as all that, I guess, Step Hen. And don't forget, please, that we're armed with weapons calculated to knock the spots out of any gray sneak that ever tried to steal venison won by 2 husky hunters. Think how you have 6 bullets in that little gun of yours, And each one ought to count for a wolf if it came to the worst." "Oh, there's where I was a fool," said Step Hen in a disgusted tone. "What's that?" demanded his chum, stopping short. "Why, I never stuck a blessed cartridge in my pocket, you see. Thought the 6 I had in the magazine of the gun would be good and plenty for all the needs I'd run up against. Now I wish I had the whole 100 along. Just my luck. I'm always losing things, and if it ain't anything else, it must be chances. Think of 100 dead wolves, and all killed with this great little gun, while I sat perched up in the crotch of a nice tree. It makes me sick to think of it, that's what, Thad." "Are you sure you did put 6 cartridges in the magazine before we left?" asked the other. "Well, that's what I meant to do, and I reckon I did, all right. Though Giraffe was joking me at the time, and he might have upset my calculations," Step Hen admitted. "Well, then, suppose you drop your bundle of meat, and take a look," advised Thad. "If it gets to warm quarters, it's just as well that you know how many wolves you can account for. Throw them out in 1, 2, 3 order now." So Step Hen began working the mechanism of his little gun. Not being excited, he was able to do this excellently. With the first cast a cartridge flew out of the rejecting opening; but when he tried to repeat, nothing happened. He looked at the gun blankly, and tried twice more, but with the same result. "No use," remarked Thad, grimly. "Nothing doing, it seems. When you thought you put 6 cartridges in the magazine, you stopped at 3. And just such little mistakes have cost many a hunter his life before now, let me tell you, Step Hen." "Oh, mercy! What do you mean, Thad?" asked the other, alarmed. "Why, suppose now, several wolves were rushing at you with open mouths, and when you stood there, feeling able to take care of them all, your gun missed fire. Not because it went back on you, but through your silly fault in not making sure it was fed to the limit when you started. Things would look kind of gloomy just then, wouldn't they?" "I'll never go out without being dead sure my magazine is plumb full, and a handful in my pocket besides, catch me again," said Step Hen, solemnly. "That's a good resolution to make, and see to it that you remember it. But all the same, my boy, it isn't helping us any just now. You've got 1 bullet, and I advise you to hang on to that to the bitter end. Let me do most of the shooting, if it ever comes to it, which I hope it won't, because I've got a belt full of all sorts of shells, from buckshot to No. 7s. Now, shall we go on again?" "Sure," replied Step Hen, cheerfully. But when he had managed to get his arms through the loops of his bundle, and began to heave it up on his back, he groaned audibly, so that Thad knew full well they would hardly make camp that night, at least not without several rests by the way. "How far do you think it is, Thad?" asked Step Hen a few minutes later, as he dragged along behind the other. "Well, I just can't tell," replied Thad. "It may be only 3 miles, and then again perhaps it would tally up twice that. We're going to strike the lake shore by keeping on as we are; but just how far away from camp gets me. Like as not we can sight their fire, and give the boys a hail that will fetch a canoe for us." "Whee! Wish that blessed canoe was here right now," murmured poor Step Hen. "You're pretty near at the end of your rope, ain't you?" asked Thad. "That's right. I acknowledge the corn, Thad. I never was so dead tired in all my life. But I've still got the grit to keep along as far as I can put one foot in front of the other." "Good for you. We'll try it a little further and see," Thad went on. He was chuckling to himself, even while he spoke; for he knew full well that, although it pleased the tenderfoot to call it grit, in truth it was fear of those lurking, howling wolves that was driving Step Hen to making these astonishing efforts. After all, there is absolutely nothing like fear to make a laggard run like a Marathon sprinter. It has even effected cures in people supposed to be paralyzed, as Thad remembered reading not a great while before. They continued on for some time longer, but from the increasing puffing and grunting that came from the region where Step Hen was staggering along, it was evident that he was about ready to give up. "Thad!" he gasped, presently. "Yes, what is it, Step Hen?" "Here's a tree," remarked the other. "I mean one that's got limbs near the ground, and not like these other tall ghostly pines that I'd need a lineman's spurs to shin up." Thad stopped for a minute. "Well, if you can't walk any further, Step Hen, say so, and I'll get up something that ought to keep the wolves away. But of course, if you're ready to call quits, why, I suppose we'll have to climb up here, and squat like a couple of owls all night." The prospect evidently did not please Step Hen any too well. Besides, he still retained a shred of his former pride. So he bristled up as he made answer, saying: "Why, of course I can go on for quite a distance yet, if you think there's any use of it, Thad. Now, what was you going to do, you said?" "Under this pine tree, you see, that's been badly used in some storm, there are a lot of branches lying. We can knock off a couple of the ones that look like they might burn pretty well, and use them for torches. Let's get busy, and see if it'll work." At any rate, it gave Step Hen another chance to rest up, and get his breath. He still clung to that heavy deer's head with its antlers. Step Hen could be a most obstinate fellow when he chose, and having once made up his mind, it was like trying to move the Rock of Gibraltar to change it. After considerable effort, and the wasting of many matches, so as to get the pine cones and needles started into a blaze, on account of the night wind that kept blowing them out as fast as Step Hen lighted them, the torches were finally made an accomplished fact. "Wave it around some more, and the wind is going to keep it going," advised Thad. "Besides, the swinging motion will warn the wolves to keep away, if they don't want to get their old hides singed. Now, if you're feeling fit, we'll make another stab at getting over the ground." Still, Thad knew they would not go far before something else would happen; and he really expected that sooner or later they would have to do battle with the hungry 4-footed denizens of the pine woods that had scented their fresh meat, and gave signs of meaning to possess some of it, no matter at what cost. So Thad bent his mind on figuring out what they had better do if it came down to a halt. He knew that once they went into camp they could build several fires so as to virtually surround themselves with a circle of flames, across which no wolf that ever lived would have the daring to jump. And consequently Thad did not feel so deeply concerned about how things would come out as his comrade did. "Did you hear that? And wasn't it a nasty snarl, though?" demanded Step Hen, after possibly 5 minutes more had passed. "Yes, I heard it, and I suppose the beasts are closing in now," Thad replied. "Closing in? Oh, my gracious! Thad, we had ought to be finding a good tree like that Jim Dandy one I wanted to climb when you said no. These torches ain't agoin' to last much longer, and I don't believe the critters care about 'em anyway. Hadn't we better change the program, Thad?" "Well, one thing I object to," the other answered. "After going to all this trouble to get venison, and losing our first deer to those woods pirates, I don't feel like letting these measly wolves share in this second lot." "Them's my sentiments exactly, Thad. But tell me how we're agoin' to prevent 'em, won't you? If it comes right down to brass tacks, we've just got to think of saving our own lives first of all, and let the precious meat go. But then, if we found a tree, we might hang it up before climbing among the branches ourselves. Then, while they were jumping and trying to snatch it down, we could be peppering the bunch like fun." "Leave it to me, Step Hen. I've got a plan worth 2 of that; though we might as well stop under this tree to try out; and if it comes to the worst, we can climb up. But I don't think it's going to be necessary. Throw down your bundle, now, and get busy. We're going to have a fire, 2, 3 of 'em, and squatting in the middle of the string, we'll just cook us some of this tender young buck, and snap our fingers at Mr. Wolf. If he gets too brash, why, we'll give him a card with our compliments. Hurry up and get a fire going, while I stand guard over you, Step Hen." End of Chapter 12. Recording by D.R. Baker Robinson. Chapter 13 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. The Fire Circle. "That's me, all right, Thad. I'll have a spark going the quickest ever, if that old wind only holds up a bit. Here's a plenty of loose stuff to begin with that I can kick together. Wait till I stick my torch in this crotch of the tree. Just as well to have some light to work by." And as he kept up this running fire of talk, Step Hen was busying himself right swiftly. For the moment he forgot all his aches and pains, and worked like a Trojan. Indeed, no defender of ancient Troy ever had more urgent reason for getting things going than Step Hen thought he did just at that minute. He used his feet and hands to gather the loose pine needles in a heap; and when he thought he had things fixed to suit him, the next business that engaged his attention was getting the pile to take fire. After that Step Hen said he would be on Easy Street. All this while the night wind had been moaning and whistling through the tops of the tall pines, making a mournful kind of music, calculated to add to the uneasiness caused by the savage howls of the hungry wolves from the north. But Step Hen had learned a lesson while lighting his torch, and knew that the wind came in gusts, with short intervals between. By waiting a few seconds after it had started to blow at quite a lively rate, he was able to find a lull, and making the most of his opportunity he hastily struck his match, and applied it to the dry stuff he had made sure to keep underneath. But after all he came very near spoiling it. For just at that very second there was a loud howl, so close at hand that Step Hen was impelled to look over his shoulder, under the impression that the wolf pack was even then about to overwhelm him while he bent down, almost defenseless, above the pile of dry stuff. "It's all right, don't worry," exclaimed Thad, who was standing guard, with his faithful Marlin gripped tight in his hands; and any wolf that attempted to try conclusions with that reliable little gun would surely regret his temerity. The flame managed to catch before the wind could come back again to blow it out; and once the connection had been made, the draught only served to make the fire burn the better. "There, that's done, and now what?" asked Step Hen, whirling around to pick up his own weapon, under the belief that he would feel easier in his mind if in a position to defend himself. "We've got to extend the fire belt, and make several more like the one you've got going," replied Thad, laying his gun down so that he might busy himself. "Here are plenty of branches, and all sorts of good burning stuff. If only Giraffe were with us now, wouldn't he be in his glory, though?" "Well," said Step Hen, slowly, "he might; and again perhaps Giraffe don't like wolves any better than I do; and he gets so rattled, too, whenever he's nervous. I try to take things as cool as anything. What's the use getting excited, when it ain't agoin' to help a single bit? And I know you'll say the same, Thad?" "You never spoke truer words, Step Hen," replied the scoutmaster, gravely; and yet secretly he was shaking with laughter, because everybody knew that Step Hen was the worst offender in that line the patrol boasted; so that it seemed almost as good as a circus, Thad afterwards declared, to hear him talk in this way. They worked diligently, and soon managed to not only extend the fire so as to take in 3 more points, and thus completely surround the spot where they had dumped the packs of venison, but to secure quite a supply of fuel besides, with which to feed the flames from time to time. "Now what?" again demanded Step Hen, when he saw that his companion meant to call a halt upon these proceedings. "Supper is the next thing on the program," observed Thad. "I feel just like enjoying some of that same venison. It will not only make us feel stronger, but considerably lighten our loads when we take a notion to go on again. Count me in on that deal; because honest Injun now, I'm that empty my stomach feels like it wanted to shake hands with my backbone. Say, this must be a real hunter's feast, Thad. I never went through such an experience as this before; and just listen to the nerve of them rascals, a-howling themselves hoarse, just because we object to sharing our grub pile with them. D'ye suppose, now, we'll have to knock over a few of the pesky varmints, as old Eli calls 'em?" "I wouldn't be one bit surprised," replied Thad; and the other noticed that he did not move in the least without making sure that his gun was within reach, from which it was evident that Thad had no intention of being caught unprepared, should the hungry wolves make a sudden dash. Of course Step Hen was next to totally ignorant as to how to cook meat without the frying pan to which he had been accustomed; and he watched just how Thad did it, closely imitating him. Taking a stout and fairly long sliver of wood, a small piece of the meat was secured to one end, after which the other point was thrust into the ground in such a position that the meat came pretty near a place where the embers burned red, and glowed invitingly. Presently the heat began to make the meat sizzle, and then it slowly cooked, turning a delightful brown color and sending out odors that made the boys fairly shiver with eagerness to start eating. When one piece was considered done, it was quickly eaten by a hungry hunter, and its place taken with a fresh supply. So the good work went on. Both boys were ravenously hungry, and only small bits could be cooked this way at a time, so that it was pretty much a whole hour before they had fully satisfied their clamorous appetites. And although the meal had been eaten under the strangest conditions of any which he could remember, Step Hen was ready to declare he had enjoyed it immensely. "But they're getting madder and madder all the while, just because we didn't send 'em an invite to our little feast," declared Step Hen. "Just listen to the critters yawp, would you, Thad? They're butting in closer and closer, a foot at a time. And honest now, I reckon there must be all the way from half a dozen to 10,000 of 'em around us." "That's a pretty good and safe range," laughed the patrol leader; "and I guess you've covered the ground all right. There are surely half a dozen of 'em, and how many more I wouldn't like to say, because I don't know just how much noise one old wolf can kick up. But don't they sing sweetly, though? Shall we be generous, and throw them out the balance of the venison, to show them how we like their song?" "Well, I should say, not any," returned Step Hen, after giving his companion a quick glance, as if to see whether he really meant it, or was only joking. "We had too much hard work getting our supply to throw it to the Dogs. Let the lazy curs run along and find some for themselves. Besides, it's too good to think of wasting it. I want the rest of the fellers to taste our venison. Mine went glimmering, and I hope it half choked that villainous crowd. Anyway, you vowed it was a whole lot tougher than this haunch, and there's that comfort." But it was evident that if the hungry animals around heard this decision, they refused to pay any attention to it. For instead of decreasing, the howls actually became louder and more insistent, until finally Thad picked up his gun. "I begin to see that we're going to have a little target practice after all, Step Hen," he remarked quietly. "When things get so bad that you can see the skulking beasts creeping about your camp, and even catch the glitter of their yellow eyes, it's nearly time to begin to bowl a few of them over, so as to inform the rest that we've got a deadline marked around here." "You don't say?" answered Step Hen in an awed tone. "Show me one, Thad, please. I'd just like to say I'd seen a wolf, really and truly, for once in my life, outside of a menagerie or a circus." "All right, then," replied the other. "Just follow the line of my finger, and I give you my word that skulking thing in the shadows is a real genuine Canada wolf. I'm going to prove it to you in a minute or two, by taking a crack at him. Oh, now there's two of 'em, Thad, crossing each other's trail. And see there, if that ain't a third, and even a fourth. Why, I believe the woods are full of 'em." "You're about right," replied the patrol leader, more seriously than before, the alarmed Step Hen thought. "Here, let's throw a few blazing brands around, to scare 'em off some, while we lift the bundles up among the branches of this tree. Then, if anything should force us to take refuge there, at any rate we wouldn't have to listen to the plaguey things chewing at our grub." This was accordingly done. When the burning bits of wood were hurled out toward them, the wolves temporarily retreated; but Thad knew full well they would soon crowd back, drawn by the scent of the fresh meat; and besides, he did not like to take the chances of setting the woods afire, just after he and the balance of the Silver Fox Patrol had accepted this new test of their abilities in the line of doing a good act as fire wardens. The 2 packages of venison were easily hoisted into the tree, Step Hen readily climbing up himself in order to lift them still higher, so that by no possibility could a leaping wolf manage to get his teeth in either bundle. Step Hen came down again a little unwillingly, Thad saw. It must have seemed good and safe up there, so far removed from the fangs of the encircling wolves; but after the fires had burned completely out, it would prove a pretty cold perch; and for one the young scoutmaster did not yearn to try it, unless every other resort failed them. "Now watch what happens," remarked Thad, as the other joined him again, gun in hand; "and remember, only shoot if you have to. I'll hold one barrel in reserve all the time. After I shoot, you'll see me get a new shell in the chamber as quick as I can work it. Be ready now, and watch sharp." No need to tell Step Hen that. He was already keyed up to top-notch condition by the excitement that caused his nerves to quiver and his breath to come in gasps. And yet, if anyone had accused the boy of being afraid, he would have at once indignantly denied the imputation. Perhaps he was holding himself sternly in hand. Thad hoped as much, but then some persons have a queer way of showing that they are cool and collected. Step Hen was one, for instance. But if all of us could realize just how we look to our neighbors, we might not feel quite so proud. Thad had his gun ready for quick work. He only waited until he could glimpse one of those skulking, shadowy forms on the outside border of the light cast by the fire circle. Then he glanced along the barrels of his gun, though instinct enabled him to cover the target better than all this aiming, after which his finger pressed the trigger. The boom of the gun was instantly succeeded by a series of alarming howls, and then Step Hen was heard shouting exultantly: "You got him then, Thad! I saw him turn a back somersault. He's a dead one, all right, I tell you. Whoop!" End of chapter 13. Recording by D.R. Baker Robinson. Chapter 14 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Step Hen has visions of a fur coat. Thad was already hastily inserting a fresh shell in the left chamber of his little shotgun. He felt fully satisfied that he had done just what Step Hen so vociferously proclaimed, knocked over one of the skulking wolves. But there were more of the same breed around, and presently they would get over the temporary fright caused by the flash of fire, together with the heavy crash, when possibly they might show themselves bolder than ever. And like a true Boy Scout, Thad Brewster believed in always being prepared. He had really taken that for his motto long before he thought of joining a troop of the Scouts; so that much of what he agreed to do when signing the muster roll lay directly in a line with his own ideas of what a wide awake boy should be. "They backed off after that hot reception, Thad," Step Hen went on. "Oh, I hope I'll get a chance to pop over just one of the sneaky beasts. I'd like to say I'd shot a real wolf. Think of me, Step Hen Bingham, who up to a year ago had never gone off camping or hunting, with a bear to my credit, a buck actually knocked over, even if it was stole away from me. And now, as the crowning event of all, I want to get a savage wolf, a real Canada wolf." "Oh," said Thad, laughingly, "I don't know that they're different from any other kind they have out on the plains, though perhaps they may be a little larger, and ready to attack a man quicker. But perhaps you'd better take the next good chance then, Step Hen." "May I, Thad? That's kind of you. Suppose you give me pointers then, and tell me just when to blaze away. I want to make a dead sure thing of it." "Of the wolf, you mean, I guess," Thad went on, keeping a bright lookout while he talked. "Well, watch that place where I got my fellow, and I think you'll soon see something moving." "You must mean the rest will be wanting to make a supper off of the critter you killed? Is that it, Thad? Are they such cannibals as all that?" asked Step Hen. "Always said to be," the patrol leader returned, and then quickly added: "Keep on the lookout, and if you see anything moving, tell me. Above all, don't waste ammunition by firing recklessly. We're not trying to scare 'em off by noise. Every shot ought to count for a wolf." They lapsed into silence for some little time, during which both boys used their eyes to the best advantage. Several times Step Hen's eagerness caused him to imagine he had caught a glimpse of a moving object; but upon calling the attention of his more experienced comrade to the spot, in every instance Thad had pronounced it a false alarm. But in the end there came a time when Thad himself saw something move, and as he watched more closely he made positive that it was another wolf creeping up in the direction of the spot where his first victim probably lay. "Are you all ready, Step Hen?" he asked, quietly. "Just try me, that's all," came the whispered reply, as the other scout clutched his rifle nervously, and strained his eyes to see what had caught the attention of his chum. "Then watch that spot where my game kicked the bucket. One of his mates is right now coming to drag the body away, to give it a wolf burial. See him, Step Hen?" "Yes, yes, and be sure and tell me just when to let him have it, Thad," replied the other, beginning to cover the indistinct moving figure with his ready gun. "Now hold on for a bit," Thad cautioned. "I'm going to give the fire here a kick that will make it spring up. Then, when you can be sure you're getting a bead on the slinker, give him Hail Columbia. Watch out now, old fellow. It's going to be your only chance to bag a genuine wolf from the Canada bush." Just as Thad had said, the fire burned briskly after he had used the toe of his boot to give it new life; and sure enough, Step Hen could see the outlines of a long, dim figure that seemed to be hugging the ground. He could even catch the odd gleam of the wicked yellow eyes that were doubtless watching their every movement. With the sharp report of his rifle there was another howl, this time of pain. "Did I get him, Thad?" cried the marksman, eagerly. "You hit him, that's certain, because I saw him flop over," replied the other; "and that yelp meant sudden pain, as sure as it stood for anything. But he managed to get off, though possibly he will fall within 20 feet." "Oh! that's too bad, because his chums'll chew him all up, and I'll never have my nice wolfskin to get a coat made out of for winter," exclaimed Step Hen. And then, as he was seized by a new thought, he went on: "But Thad, suppose I took a torch and went out there, do you think I'd be apt to find him lying on his back? I'd like the worst kind to get hold of him before the rest of the bunch muster up courage enough to come back." "Well, since you haven't even a load in your gun, that would be too risky a game for you to play, Step Hen, and just for an old wolfskin at that. Perhaps we've given 'em such a bad scare now that the rest of the pack may skip out, and leave us in peace. Then in the morning you'd find your chap all right." "Listen! There's something crashing through the bushes right back of us, Thad!" exclaimed Step Hen, a minute later, though his companion knew it before he spoke. "Sounds like an elephant might be coming down on us; but they don't have such animals up here in the Maine woods, do they? Just hear the racket he keeps making, Thad. Whatever do you suppose we're up against now?" Thad laughed. "That's a 2-legged elephant, then, Step Hen," he remarked. "Fact is, we're going to have company, for that's a man pushing through the brush, and making all the noise he can so as to scare the wolves away, and at the same time keep us from firing on him." Then raising his voice, Thad called out: "Hello there!" "That you, Thad?" came an answering call. "Hurrah! It's old Eli!" exclaimed Step Hen, readily recognizing the voice of the guide. "This way, Eli. We're having a healthy old time knocking over some of your Canada wolves. Each got one so far, but I reckon the rest of the pack must a lit out when they heard you comin'. I see you now, Eli, and mighty glad you dropped in on us. Where did you spring from, anyway? Don't tell me we're as near the camp as that?" Eli came up with a wide grin on his face. "Oh, camp 'bout 1.5 miles down lake," he remarked, as he gravely shook hands with each hunter in turn. "We saw a light of fire over point, and think it might be you boys, so I paddled canoe across here. It ain't just 5 minutes walk 'cross this strip to the lake. So you got some of the critters, did you?" "Thad, can't we look up that one I shot now? I just hate to lose him, you know?" begged Step Hen. "Why, I suppose it would be safe for all of us to go out," returned the patrol leader. "Here, pick up something that will burn, and come along." They found Thad's victim without any trouble, but the second one was not within range of the light from their torches. But poor anxious Step Hen begged so piteously to be allowed to extend the search just a little further, that Thad did not have the heart to say no. And a minute later, after they had gone forward twice as far as Thad had at first intended, Step Hen gave a gurgling cry. "Looky there, Thad! What's that thing lying over yonder? Seems to me mighty like a dead one. Yes, sir, that's what it is, as sure as I'm Step Hen Bingham. Oh! how terrible he looks, even when stretched out there, and gone up the flue. My wolf, too. What a fine coat he's got, and as gray as they make 'em. Say, won't I just cut a swell when I wear that out in a sleigh with Sue Baker, and every time she rubs the sleeve she'll say, 'And just to think that you shot this savage old wolf all by yourself, Step Hen. Oh, what a brave fellow you are!'" It was a second dead wolf, sure enough. The little repeating rifle had, as usual, given a good account of itself, and the stricken beast had only been able to drag himself a little distance away before giving up. Both animals were dragged over to the fires, and then Eli set to work taking off the skins with a rapidity that told of long experience along the trapping line. "No use of lugging these critters over to the canoe and then to camp," Eli had announced. "Their 2 skins'll make a purty good coat, I guess now. And so you gut a pack of prime venison to tote home as well, hev you? That's good. My mouth's just made up for a steak, and the boys'll feel tickled ter death when they sees yer." Step Hen was a little nervous at leaving the fire zone, especially since Eli and Thad insisted on putting out every spark before departing, according to the law of the state. But then he managed to carry 1 torch, and with that to serve them they took up their line of march. It was not so very far to the edge of the lake. Thad laughed, and said the joke was on him, because when they halted he really believed they were a couple of miles away from water. If he had known the shore was so near by, he would have managed to coax the tired Step Hen to trudge on just a little further, so as to camp with the water covering one side, and bringing that much security, not to speak of the chances for signaling to the home camp by means of the code which he and Allan, as Boy Scouts, understood. But it was all right now, and Step Hen felt quite merry over the chance of being taken comfortably to the camp by means of the canoe. Eli did the paddling, and the 2 weary lads just snuggled down in the boat, feeling that they had had a great day of it, all told. The presence of the venison, as well as the wolf skins, would be positive proof as to the reliability of their astonishing story, should there be any skeptic around. And then Thad had the wonderful mushroomed bullet that had killed that 6-pronged buck, so that as they narrated the first adventure that had come their way, they could produce evidence to back up the story. Their coming was greeted by more or less enthusiasm, although the boys had evidently been coached by Allan not to be too vociferous, as they were in a country where timid game abounded, and it was poor policy to frighten away the quarry they had come so far to secure. Step Hen forgot all his weariness as he found himself being shaken by the hand again and again, while he and Thad told the tale of their day's outing. It was nice to play the hero part once in a while, and more than ever did Step Hen feel that life had become more worth living than ever, since he joined the Cranford troop of Boy Scouts. But for that, he would never have discovered what splendid things there were to be met with in the great forests, and the spirit of the hunter and the fisherman, which had lain dormant in his nature, might never have been awakened. And while the hour was rather late, all of the boys insisted on tasting a small piece of the deer meat brought in by the 2 successful Nimrods. End of chapter 14. Recording by D.R. Baker Robinson. Chapter 15 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. The Fox Farmer. "Say, this is the greatest venison I ever tasted," declared Bumpus, after he had disposed of his share, and sighed to think that the rules of the game debarred him from having a second piece, because they had had a bumper supper only a few hours before. "Just dandy," added Giraffe, who was in the same class as his fat campmate, and would have been only too glad for an invitation to cut and come again. "Oh!" exclaimed Step Hen suddenly. "I reckon we've got to congratulate you, Giraffe." "Me? What do you mean, Step Hen?" replied the tall scout, at the same time beginning to look a trifle confused. "Why, you told us we'd be surprised when we got back," the other went on to say, a little maliciously; "and I reckon you've gone and done it at last, and now you're ready to show us just how easy it works." Bumpus could not refrain for the life of him from giving a sarcastic chuckle, which of course added to the evident embarrassment of Giraffe, who, however, assumed a serious air upon making his reply. "Well, not exactly, Step Hen. I've got her figured out all right in my mind, so that in the morning I can go ahead and work out the details. I calculate a short half hour ought to see me wind up in just a blaze of glory. But just yet it's a toss-up who the ice cream's going to be on, Bumpus or me." "Oh, I ain't worrying even a little mite," asserted the confident Bumpus. "Well, you wait and see," declared Giraffe defiantly. "You don't all know what I've got up my sleeve. The feller that laughs last laughs loudest, they say. And I give you all fair warning that's going to be me." Meanwhile Thad managed to get in close touch with Jim Hasty. When the others were joking and having a merry time, he was wondering how the guide's little affair had been working out. Many hours had passed since he had seen Jim, and he wondered whether the latter could have had any further communication from Old Cale, or even run across the father of his wife in the pine woods. Jim was looking a little more serious than ever, but so far as Thad could discover there was nothing about him to indicate that he had been in violent collision with an enemy. And there were both his ears in their proper places, which fact might be taken as positive proof that the giant poacher had at least so far not attempted to carry out his terrible threat. Jim seemed to know what was passing through the boy's mind, for he smiled faintly, and shook his head in the negative. "Nothing new happened then, Jim?" questioned the patrol leader. "Naw, I ain't been far from camp the whole blessed day, and consequently never had no chance to run up against Paul Martin," replied the other. "But I'm more sot than ever to see him face to face, afore I quits this here region. It's just got to be done, else I wouldn't hev the nerve to face Little Lina again. She made me promise, and by thunder, nawthin' hain't goin' to skeer me off, if he don't hunt me out, by ding! I'll take a turn at it, and find Cale Martin myself, if so be I gotter tramp all the way to his shack, which I knows only too well." "Good for you, Jim," said Thad, admiringly; "but I suppose you understand what risk you're taking in trying that game. From all I've heard about Cale Martin, he's surely a terror; and then the threat he made about your ears would be enough to scare most men away." Jim drew a long breath as he answered this. "Lots of people don't know Old Cale like I does. He hain't so black, nor they just paints him. Them game wardens is afeared of him, and they piles all kinds of things on his shoulders that he ain't no business to carry." "Yes, I've heard before about giving a dog a bad name, and then he has to bear the sins of the whole neighborhood," remarked Thad. "There is never a sheep killed but that Dog Tray is the guilty one. And so you think Cale isn't altogether so bad as we've heard?" "He's a big man, and he's got an orful temper; but it's them two critters he goes with that's the wust cases. They just draw him in her slick games. Cale, he'd never think of tryin', left by hisself. But we heerd as how he's struck a new thing, if so be he only knows enough ter keep it goin', and shakes them other fellers. And if anybody kin make a success of fox raisin', I just guess Cale is their man, 'cause he knows all erbout the slick little varmints, from A ter Z." "Fox raising!" exclaimed Thad, at once deeply interested. "Tell me about that, Jim. Seems like it ought to be worth while listening to." "Why," said Jim, apparently only too well pleased to say something in favor of the big and reckless parent of his little wife, "yer see, thar's a company as hes been formed way down in Bosting to raise foxes o' all kinds, jest to git the pelts. I s'pose you knows as how them skins are agittin' more valerable every blessed year. More people to wear furs, and less animals to give 'em. Why, thar was $1,200 paid for a black fox pelt jest last spring, and I seen the check with my own eyes." "Yes," Thad went on, deeply interested, "I've understood that tremendous prices were being paid out for that scarce skin. But is Cale meaning to try and raise black or silver foxes for the market? I was told by several people that they considered the silver fox only a freak, and that they would never breed true to species. How about that, Jim?" "I've allers hed an ijee that way myself," returned the short guide, scratching his head in a reflective manner; "but Cale, he thinks the other way; and Cale, he sure knows more 'bout foxes in a day than I would in a year. Wall, we done heard as how he hed made a contract with this company for a number of years to act as manager of ther farm. It's in another part of ther state, an' when Cale, he leaves here arter a leetle while, he never expects to come back agin. Wouldn't be surprised naow if he hed a few foxes over to ther old shack as he means to kerry away with him when he quits up here." "But do you suppose he'll stick to those two tough characters, and keep them with him in his new job? Won't they queer his game with the company, Jim?" "Wall, I doan't know, of course, what his plans be; but Cale, he's a great feller to keep his word; an' if so be he's told this company as he'll run things straight, jest believe me they ain't agoin' to be no place for them two poachers around his fox farm. He'd run 'em off with his gun mighty quick. Yes, Cale keeps his word; an' thet's what makes me a leetle bit shy 'bout bein' able to convince him to leave my ears where they belongs. But Lina, bless her, says as haow he jest can't hold aout when he hears what I gotter tell him; an' Lina, she orter know." Thad admired the man more than ever. Just because of his faith in Lina, here was Jim ready to put his head in the lion's mouth, so to speak. Thad suspected that he might be carrying some very important intelligence to the bearded giant of the pine woods; but whatever it was, Jim did not take the trouble to enlighten him; and Thad did not really think he had any business to ask. After that, Jim seemed to lapse into silence; and seeing that he did not appear anxious to continue the talk along lines that concerned his personal matters, the scoutmaster turned to the others again. The hour was now getting rather late; and while those who had remained in camp during much of the day might not be unusually tired, Step Hen gave signs of falling asleep by the fire. Several times his head gave a lurch to one side, so that presently Giraffe caught him roughly by the arm. "See here, do you want to take a header square into the blaze, Step Hen?" he demanded, as the other opened his eyes, and looked sleepily at him. "I like fires as well as anybody, but excuse me from getting roasted in one. Don't you think he ought to be sent to bed, Mr. Scoutmaster? He's so logy right now that the chances are 10 to 1 he'll climb in, and wrap the blanket around his head instead of his feet. Seems like you'll have to appoint a dry nurse to look after the poor baby, or else he may freeze to death in the night." But Step Hen did not wait for any permission to retire. He just crept away, and vanished under the folds of the second tent which he shared with Thad and Davy Jones. Indeed, the others were that sleepy they declared they would not be long in following his example. Thad himself was the first to get up and stretch. "It's late, fellows, and we ought to be turning in, if we want to be good for anything to morrow. And remember that if this sort of thing keeps up, we're going to change the program, and let every scout have a share in keeping sentry duty, working in couples. It doesn't seem exactly fair that when Eli and Jim have to work all day with the paddles, or in any other way, they got to spend half the night standing guard. Hello, there's Eli right now, coming in on the trot as if he had some news for us. What's up, Eli?" The old guide had been down to the shore of the lake to take a look at the canoes; and he was plainly bringing some sort of news, if they could judge from his hasty steps, and the look of concern on his dark face. "Canoe comin' along down yonder; mout be Cale's agoin' to pay us a visit," he remarked; and his words aroused the sleepy boys, as thoroughly as though they had been ducked with a bucket of ice water. They all hastened to step off toward the shore. Bumpus even picked up his gun, possibly under the belief that there might be a speck of war on the horizon. Jim looked a trifle uneasy, but there was a grimness in the way he shut his jaws together that told of his set purpose to face the music somehow or other, before leaving this country of the Eagle Lakes. "There it comes!" announced Giraffe in a half whisper, as he pointed to the left. They could soon all make out the dim, shadowy canoe that was stealing along, some little distance from the shore, and evidently bent on passing the camp. "I c'n jest make out two fellers in her," said Eli, who had sharp eyes. "I reckon one of them must be Old Cale, then. He seems to be shading his eyes with his hand, alookin' toward our fire, and us a-standin' here," Giraffe went on to say, though no one could be really positive, because the light was so poor. The canoe passed by in this spectral fashion. There was no hail from those who sat in the boat, one using the paddle with the usual dexterity of a Maine guide; and of course none of the scouts thought of calling out, knowing who and what the voyagers were. "I suppose that was Old Cale in the bow?" remarked Thad, after the canoe had faded away. "And he was lookin' for me, I kinder guess," said Jim, mournfully, at the same time as if mechanically raising a hand to feel of his ears. CHAPTer 15 Chapter 16 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. A Startling Awakening. It was about 4 o'clock on the following afternoon when the 3 canoes containing the boys of the Silver Fox Patrol, accompanied by their 2 guides, drew up once more on the lake shore, and preparations for going into camp were hastily commenced, since night would soon be upon them. Jim had selected this site for their last camp on this lake. When they left it, they intended going through the rest of the chain, and then seeking the railroad, with the idea of starting homeward again. And Thad wondered whether, in picking out this camp, Jim might not have an eye to his own affairs. Perhaps it was not many miles away from the shack of Cale Martin, the man who had been logger, trapper, guide, and was now about to turn his superior knowledge concerning foxes into a profitable channel, and raise them for their valuable furs. Thad hoped that, for the sake of Jim's peace of mind, he might carry out his plan before they broke camp here. And secretly he was determined that, should the guide decide to take a chance at finding Old Cale at home, he would not be averse to accompanying Jim across country to the place where Little Lina used to live before she ran away with Jim. Despite his positive conviction that he was really on the eve of succeeding with his fire making by the aid of his little bow and the twirling stick, Giraffe had failed to accomplish what he expected that morning. Why, he hardly ate any breakfast, so engrossed had he been in his fiddling, as Bumpus contemptuously called it, whenever he saw the tall scout working that clumsy little bow. But as usual, some little thing went wrong that spoiled the whole combination; and of course fire did not reward the hard labor Giraffe put in. He looked so bitterly disappointed that even Bumpus did not have the heart to taunt him, though as a rule the fat boy could be depended on to do his share of such. But then it had been arranged that Giraffe and Bumpus were to go out on a hunt on the following day, all by themselves, and without even a guide along. Giraffe had boasted so often now that he felt himself fully competent to look after himself when adrift in the woods, that Thad thought it might be a good thing to give him the chance. And there was Bumpus, eager to make use of his new gun. Nothing would please him better than to accompany the tall scout. Of course, neither Thad, nor any one else for that matter, ever suspected that they would bag any game, unless it might be a few half-tame partridges that would sit on a limb and wait to be knocked over. Indeed, Thad was of the opinion that in the end the 2 bold Nimrods might even get lost and have to be searched for. But then they would unquestionably leave a plain trail that the guides could pick up without great trouble, and the experience would be worth much to both Giraffe and Bumpus. They were really getting too scrappy in their dealings with each other, and a little spice, such as must accompany losing themselves in the woods, and being dependent on each other entirely, might draw them together, Thad thought, and make them appreciate each other more. As they sat around the blaze that night, after they had partaken of a generous supper, Thad purposely led the conversation to the subject of fires in the woods. Allen had told of some experiences he met with some years back, and of course both guides were able to supplement this with stirring yarns that thrilled the blood of the young listeners. "And I reckon now, Eli," Thad went on, after the guide had finished what he had to tell, "that you never saw the pine woods in better condition for a fire than they are right now." "Thet air a fact," replied the other, emphatically. "Dry as tinder, an' if we don't git some snow mighty soon, I guess as how there'll be thousands o' acres o' valerable land burned over afore Thanksgivin' time." "You must have seen some lands that had been burned on their way up on their train," interjected Jim, breaking his long silence; "and you kin understand jest how lonesome they 'pears like, with their tall pines a-standin' there like flagpoles, black and without airy limb, or else a-layin' in winders on the ground. Allers makes me feel bad to see such things." "And the game deserts a burned tract, too," declared Allan. "It sure do," Jim went on, with a shake of the head. "You never seen a more desolate region than sech a burned territory. Everybody moves out as quick as they kin. Fact is, most on 'em hes got their houses burned, an' don't have ter carry much away with 'em. I hopes as how it'll snow or rain right soon, so's to save miles and miles of woodland." "And the fire wardens have their work cut out for them at this season of the year, you can easily believe," observed Allan. "Wonder now if we'll see a real genuine forest fire while we're up here," remarked Giraffe, with considerable interest. "My, but she must look great to see them pines a-flamin' up like big torches. Now, you needn't gimme that look, Thad, because I haven't forgot my promise, and I ain't a-carryin' a single match along with me day after day. But if somebody else sets fire to the woods, I have as good a right to look as the next one, ain't I?" "Of course you have, Giraffe," replied the scoutmaster, relieved; because this overpowering passion on the part of the tall boy had given him many anxious minutes since coming into Maine. "Lots of these fires come after the loggers have done their work," Allan volunteered. "You see, they leave a tremendous amount of stuff behind, all the limbs and branches of the trees they have cut down, as they are only after the main stem. So when this gets nice and dry, after a year or so, and a fire starts, with a brisk wind to whip it, what follows is more than I can describe. I saw one such fire, and we only escaped with our lives by the quick wit of a logger along with the party." "What did you do, Allan?" asked Bumpus, eagerly. "You know, I'm going out with Giraffe to morrow, and if we did meet up with a forest on fire, I couldn't run like he can, with his long legs. So I'd like to know another way to give the old fire the go by. Please explain how you cheated it." "Why, Allan, it might save my life, too, for all you know." "Glad to hear that you're interested, Bumpus," answered the other, readily. "And I think every one of you ought to know about it. When you're out hunting, try and keep the location of any stream you happen to pass in your mind. Then, in case of being beset by fire, make your way there, and get in up to your neck. You're going to be safe there every time. If it gets hot, duck under and cool off. I'll sure never forget the time I had; but then I hope none of you will ever have to hunt for a stream, or that you'll even see a forest fire when up here, no matter how much Giraffe wants to look on one." Giraffe had dropped out of the circle, and apparently some idea had just flashed into his mind connected with his pursuit of that slippery contract, whereby he expected sooner or later to make fire come, after the fashion of the far away islanders of the Pacific. No one paid much attention, for they were heartily sick of seeing him sawing away with his little bow, wasting so much time, most of them thought; though Thad, for his part, was secretly pleased to see that the tall scout stuck at his apparently hopeless job, with a persistence that must win out in the end. Thad had been explaining just what the new system of standing sentry was to be. Each of the scouts would have his turn, even Bumpus being called on, though his partner was to be old Eli. There being 8 of them, their fixed posts would not run much over an hour and a half each; and it was to be expected that the boys might receive more or less benefit from having to assume some of the responsibility of the camp's security. Bumpus had been yawning for some time, and presently, taking advantage of a lull in the conversation, the fat boy clumsily gained his feet, and made a lunge for the nearest tent in which he was supposed to sleep. No one was really surprised to see Bumpus trip, and go floundering to the earth, for he frequently got his legs twisted, and did that. But when there was a shout of consternation, and the tall form of Giraffe bounded erect, they realized that Bumpus had actually fallen over his chum, not noticing him because his eyes were so heavy with sleep. "Oh, Giraffe, excuse me, please," he remarked, as he rolled over and sat up. "I give you my word, I didn't know you were there. I was rubbing my eyes, because they felt so hot and tired looking into the fire so long. Hope I didn't hurt you any." "Hurt me?" grumbled Giraffe. "I wouldn't care for that so much, even if you'd broken a rib or two in my side. But to think that you'd upset me just when I was a-going to make it burst out into a nice little flame. Why, she was smoking to beat the band when you knocked it all into a cocked hat by busting my bow, and now I'll have to sit up another hour making a new one. It's always the way. I'm having the toughest luck ever was about that business, but I can hang on, like a bulldog to the seat of your trousers when you're getting over the fence. I'm game, all right. I'm a-going to get that if it takes a leg." But his bow, he found, could be easily repaired, as it was only the cord that had been broken. And half an hour later everybody in camp was sound asleep, saving Thad and Allen, who had taken the first watch, so as to sit there and talk in whispers, for the patrol leader wanted to tell his chum all about Jim's case, because he felt so great an admiration for the short guide. When their turn had expired, according to the little nickel watch Thad carried, they woke up Eli, who, with Bumpus, was to take the next spell. In turn, they were expected to arouse Step Hen and Davy Jones, to be followed by Jim and Giraffe; and this would finish the night, as daylight must arrive while the last named were on duty. Thad was a good sleeper, although as a rule the slightest thing of an unusual nature aroused him. He believed that the camp would be well watched, and when he lay down did not allow himself to get to thinking of anything to the contrary, for fear that if his brain once got to working he might lie awake for a long time. He had a dim recollection of the two boys who occupied the tent with him, Step Hen and Davy, creeping out when Eli summoned them. Then came an uncertain length of time, which Thad could never measure, for he was sound asleep when it seemed to him someone was shouting something in his dreams. He sat up, and bumped his head on some object that had fallen out of place, but he was now fully awake, and felt a thrill when he heard real shouts outside in the voices of Step Hen and Davy Jones. "Hey, everybody get busy here! The whole camp's on fire, and the wind driving it into the woods like hot cakes! Hurry up, everybody!" End of chapter 16. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. Chapter 17 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Fighting the Flames. Out of the tent crawled Thad, utterly regardless of the fact that he was not altogether warmly clad for a cold night. And what met his eyes when he reached the open was enough to excite him still further. The wind was blowing pretty stiffly, and the fire had already jumped into the brush surrounding the camp. If given its head for even a short time, it seemed bound to get started in the dead pine needles, and once it spread there, all the desperate efforts of a dozen firefighters would be wasted. Several figures could be seen, bounding here and there, and slashing at the red flames with anything they could get hold of that would answer to bring about a halt in their spread. Of course, these must be the late guardians of the sleeping camp who were now shouting so strenuously, and begging the rest of the campers to come to their aid, Step Hen and Davy Jones. Besides, there were the guides hard at work, having been aroused with the first cries, for they still persisted in sleeping under a rude shelter they had made out of branches and weeds. Thad rushed into the fray, and began to do his very utmost to keep the dreaded fire in check. He saw that the others were also crawling forth, Bumpus, Giraffe, and Allen, all occupants of the first tent. And realizing the importance of concerted action, they lost not a second in getting busy. Bumpus in particular was a sight to behold, and had he been less busy Thad felt that he must have doubled up with laughter to see him. He persisted in donning a most stunning red checked suit of pajamas; for being so stout he did not suffer from the cold as much as some of the others. And as his simple heart was wrapped up in the business that just then engaged his full attention, Bumpus was prancing around, looking more like a clown from the circus than anything Thad could think of. But all the same, the fat boy fought tooth and nail at the spreading fire. He had on his shoes, as had the others, so that he could jump on the creeping flames when all else failed. And using an extra piece of canvas that sometimes had done duty as a tent floor, Bumpus sailed into the fray like a hurricane. Indeed, they were all as busy as beavers for a short time. Every scout seemed to feel that it would be a lasting disgrace on the name of the Silver Fox Patrol if that fire got away into the woods. They had assumed the responsibilities of assistant fire wardens, and it would be a sorry joke indeed if, instead of putting out a conflagration, they themselves were the cause of one that swept the whole adjacent territory. "Give it thunder!" shouted Giraffe, as he threshed wildly at every head of fire he could see near his boundary of action. "Hit him again, boys!" shrilled Bumpus, as he continued to do his great act of working with both hands and feet at the same time, all serving to quench the threatening flames. But Step Hen and Davy were strangely silent, though they worked as hard as any one. They knew that they were to blame for all the trouble, for they had slept on their post, and with this sad result. Finally success came to the hard working scouts and their allies, the two guides. The fire was completely routed, bag and baggage, before it managed to get a good foothold in the dry woods; and perspiring as though it were the good old summer time, the boys hastened to get more clothes on them for fear of catching cold. The fire was resurrected, and they sat down to have a powwow. "Oh, you needn't all look at us that way," grunted Step Hen. "We're guilty, all right. Knock us all if you want to, because I just guess now we deserve it. But we never meant to go to sleep there by the fire, did we, Davy?" "Well, I should say not," replied the other culprit, looking quite dejected. "We kept a-tellin' each other that we mustn't sleep right along; and then to think that after all we did drop off, and both together." "First thing I remember," said Step Hen, as if resolved, after pleading guilty, to open up and throw himself on the mercy of the court, "I heard a queer crackling noise, and openin' my eyes, my stars! The whole world seemed like it was afire. I gave Davy a punch in the side, and then jumped for it. We thought at first we could get her under control. Then I saw it was a no go, for the old fire kept extendin' all the while. So I started to wake you all, and Davy he joined in. After that Eli and Jim joined us, and then the rest of you came; and believe me, fellers, Davy and me'll never forget it. You did handsome by us, and we've been saved from disgrace that would have sent us into an early grave, Davy?" "Just so," granted the other, who was licking several burns he had received on his bare hands during the fierce little engagement just ended; though he made no complaint, seeming to think he had gotten off pretty easily, considering the serious offense of which he had been guilty, that of sleeping on his post, and which might have cost him his life in war times, had he been a soldier. Thad noticed this fact, and quietly getting out some salve he carried for just such occasions, forced Davy to let him attend to his hurts, though the other insisted that they did not amount to much, anyway. "How do you think it got started?" Giraffe asked, and in so doing he really voiced the thoughts of everybody. "Huh! I reckon that's an easy one to answer," replied Step Hen promptly. "Anybody can see at just a single look that the wind must have picked up a live coal from the fire, and carried it into a bunch of stuff to leeward. After that it was fanned, till it spread wider and wider. That was going on while Davy and me snoozed away like a pair of sillies. No use talking, boys. I'm ashamed of myself; and let me tell you, it'll be a long time before I ever go to sleep on duty again, not if I have to keep jabbing a pin into my leg every minute or so, to make me jump." "Does that explanation go, Thad?" asked Bumpus, still breathing hard after his recent violent exertions. "Well, it looks that way, for the fire was actually to leeward of the camp when I first saw it," answered the patrol leader. But there must have been something in his manner rather than his speech that caught the attention of Giraffe. "But you ain't quite satisfied, are you, Thad?" he remarked, pointedly. "You just keep a-thinking that perhaps it wasn't an accident after all? Am I right now?" "Wow! What does that kind of talk stand for?" burst out Bumpus. "Are you hinting that it was all a part of a dark scheme to burn us out of camp?" "Wait till Eli and Jim come back," Thad went on. "You've noticed that they're not with us right now. Fact is, they took the lantern, and went off about the time we were finishing our dressing. But before they went, Jim gave me to understand what they had some reason to suspect." "The work of Big Cale Martin and his crowd? Is that what you're aiming to tell us, Thad?" demanded Giraffe. "Here they come," was all Thad said. "Oh, my! "I thought you meant the game poachers," exclaimed Bumpus, who had made a half movement in the direction of his gun, standing conveniently near. The two guides joined the circle around the fire. Eli held his hands out to the blaze, as though they felt cold in that nipping night air. Jim simply caught the inquiring eye of the scoutmaster, and immediately nodded his head in the affirmative. And Thad knew from that they had surely made some sort of important discovery. "What is it, Jim?" he asked. "They've been around here. We found their tracks lots of places," came the reply. "Do you mean Cale and Si and Ed?" asked the other. "Only Si and Ed," answered Jim. "Cale, he warn't there 'tall. We'd sized up his big tracks if he'd been. They was 2 men in that canoe larst night, you seen, while them must a been their lot as fired the brush. I guess as how Cale, he must a gone back to his shack by now." "But what on earth could they expect to get by burning us out?" demanded Bumpus.
"Fust place, they never expected to burn their camp," observed Jim. "If they had, don't you believe they'd a gone to windward to start that blaze? Wall, they had a game with 2 of that up their sleeve."
"Tell us what it was, Jim," urged Thad, though he himself had already jumped to a conclusion in the matter.
"I guess as how they'd sort we'd have to make off a long distance away from camp to fight the fire, and then they'd have plenty of time to clean her out. But you see, we didn't get fur away 'tall, so they had all their work for nothin'. But them tracks was as plain as anything, wa'n't they, Eli?" Jim went on.
"They be," was the conclusive testimony of the older guide, and every one of the scouts understood that Eli had set the seal of his approval on all that Jim had said. It was certainly very unpleasant to realize that they were objects of desire on the part of even a pair of unscrupulous scamps, granting that big Cale Martin had retired from the combination. The boys seemed to get more indignant the longer they discussed the situation. There was Bumpus, usually so mild and peaceful, fairly palpitating with the desire to draw a bead upon those 2 unprincipled rascals.
"We don't stand for much nonsense from outsiders, do we, fellers?" he appealed to the other 5. "Once before on this trip some bad men thought to get fresh with the Silver Fox Patrol. You all know what happened to Charlie Barnes, the leader of that bunch of yeggs that broke into the bank. Didn't we make the capture, though, and astonish Sheriff Green? And ain't we going to get ever so much money for recovering the stolen stuff? Well, that's what's going to happen to those husky chaps if they get too gay with us. They better go slow. If they can read, they'll see we're marked dangerous, handle with care."
"Yes," said Giraffe. "We'll just have to get busy, and hand these sillies over to the head game warden. They're trying to interfere with our having the time of our lives up here in Maine, and we don't stand for anything like that." None of them felt like getting back to their blankets in a hurry after all that scare. So they just sat there around the fire, some of them with the blankets thrown over their shoulders, and compared notes all along the line. For what the guides had just told concerning the scheme of the unprincipled poachers filled the scouts with both indignation and anger. And more than one of them resolved that when his time came to watch, he would make sure to keep a loaded gun close to his hand, to be used to give the prowlers the fright of their lives. End of Chapter 17. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. Chapter 18 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Even when a compass failed them. "What would you do, Bumpus," said Step Hen after a while, "if you couldn't find a creek to wade in with the fire all around you?" "Well, d'ye know, I was just a-thinking about that same thing," replied the fat scout, who had thrown a blanket around him, and not bothered dressing; and as he sat there on a log he looked somewhat like a lazy Indian. "I hope you came to some conclusion," observed Giraffe; "because if we happen to run across a conflagration to morrow, when we're out hunting, it'll be some comfort to me to know when I'm spinning along that you're snug and safe behind, and not being devoured by the flames." "Well, the only thing I could think of," Bumpus went on soberly,
seeing that a feller can't sprout wings right away when he needs the same, nor hatch up an aeroplane to carry him out of the danger zone. The only thing for me to do would be to hunt around for a woodchuck's hole, and push in feet first." There was a laugh at that remark, which seemed to surprise Bumpus, for he looked with elevated eyebrows at each of the others in turn. "You seem to think I'm joking," he remarked, as if offended by the levity. "Well," continued Giraffe, "in the first place, you'd possibly find a heap of trouble discovering a woodchuck's hole in these Maine woods, especially when you're in a big hurry. And then again, fancy the kind of woodchuck that had a hole of a size to accommodate you, Bumpus Hawtree." The fat boy sighed. "That's what I get all along the line," he declared. "There ain't no place in all this world for a feller that's nearly as round as he is tall. I tell you, I'm going to find some way of getting rid of all this superabundance of flesh, if I have to walk it off by taking tremendous tramps. Some people tell me it can be done by going hungry a week or two at a time. But what's the use of living if you can't eat? That's what. So I'm in a peck of trouble. Won't somebody tell me what to do?" Of course, with such an open invitation, they hastened to accommodate him; and if poor Bumpus tried even a part of the numerous joking plans offered for his consideration, he would soon have no need for either food or energy, since they would, as he declared, be putting his wooden overcoat on him. Finally, however, the boys began to slip back once more into the tents, all but Giraffe, who was to finish the night with Jim, although there was hardly another hour now before daylight. "Just suits me, boys," declared the tall scout, as he prepared to sit out his turn as sentry. "You see, I can be thinking over that knotty problem I've just got to figure out before we leave this part of the country. And I've an idea that I'm getting mighty warm on that proposition now. Would sure had it dead to rights, only for clumsy Bumpus tumbling over me." But no one paid much attention to what Giraffe was saying. They had by now grown so accustomed to hearing him always promising great things by tomorrow, that it went in one ear and came out of the other, Davy Jones said. When the morning came, the camp became a scene of activity. While some of the party were busily engaged cooking a good breakfast, and it needed a lot to satisfy the healthy appetites of 6 growing boys, not to mention 2 husky guides, others were examining the tracks that had been found after the fire. And it was the universal opinion that 2 prowlers had indeed started the fire, with the idea that the inmates of the camp, rushing out to fight its spread, might get so far away that it would leave the way open for the thieves to make a sweep of any valuables left unguarded in that exciting hour. Bumpus and Giraffe were making all the preparations, looking to their sallying forth, as the latter termed it, like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza of old, determined to do wonderful things. Thad saw that they felt as if they knew it all, and he realized that in such a case advice was not desired, so he said nothing about what they ought to take. If they forgot anything, they must do without, and next time think again. Presently the 2 waved their hands merrily to their chums, and started forth. Bumpus looked like a well-laden, led animal as he trotted along at the heels of the tall scout, who was to do the piloting of the expedition. "Don't keep supper for us if we're late," airily called back Bumpus. "We may get further away than we can manage in one day, and have to camp alone, like Thad and Step Hen did. And if some of them old wolves pay us a visit, they'll wish they hadn't. Giraffe is toting his old heavyweight rifle, and here I am with my new double-barreled gun and 50 shells. Catch me getting caught like Step Hen did, with a few charges for my trusty weapon. Goodbye, fellers. See you later." "Goodbye, and good luck," called out Davy Jones, waving his cap 3 times to represent his idea as to the right kind of a send-off. The hunters got along very well for several miles, though Giraffe was forever forging protests from Bumpus. "What do you take me for, Giraffe?" he would exclaim, as he caught up with the waiting leader, and wiped the perspiration from his brow, despite the fact that the day was pretty cold. "You know I ain't built on the same lines as you. And in a case of this kind, the one that can go faster just has to accommodate himself to the pace of the slow one. You're the hare, and I'm like the poor old tortoise. But please remember that the turtle came in winner after all in the race. Not always to the swift, you know, does the race go. I may beat you out in the long run with the endurance test. If I've got anything at all, it's grit." "Yes, you will," sneered Giraffe. But after the third stop he did moderate his speed considerably. Perhaps he was beginning to get a little tired himself, and did not feel unwilling to draw in a peg or two. At noon they ate a cold lunch, for they had come upon certain tracks that told Giraffe there had been an animal of some kind there. He wished he knew how to tell what species it belonged to, and just how long ago the tracks had been made. "And mark me, Bumpus," he said, impressively, "I'm going to learn all those kind of things right away, as soon as I can take my mind off this pesky fire puzzle. I can see how handy it is to be able to read signs when you're off huntin'. Why, when we start to follerin' these here tracks after we've eaten our grub, how on earth do we know whether they were made a week ago, or if some cow broke loose from a backwoods home up here, and wandered this way? A nice pair of chumps we'd be, wouldn't we, if we went and shot up a pet cow, and had to pay damages? I reckon the boys never got over the joke." "That's just what I was thinking myself, Giraffe," agreed the other, as he sat down beside the tall scout on a fallen tree, and took out the lunch from his haversack, for he had carried it all morning, and Giraffe had let him, too. "If we're going in for this scouting business, we ought to swallow the whole business. Now, as for learning things connected with the woods, where could you find any fellers better qualified to put us straight than we've got in Thad and Allen? What one don't know, the other sure does. I'm bound to learn the game. Owning this dandy gun has given me a new idea. I used to say, 'Oh, what's the use of bothering when you've got somebody else to do your thinking for you?' But now I begin to see that you can't always depend on others. Right here is a case in point." As their minds ran about in the same channel, the two boys managed to get along splendidly. Their little differences of the past were, for the time being at least, quite forgotten, and they seemed drawn toward each other as two comrades should be. But both began to complain, because thus far neither of them had had occasion to make use of their gun. If this was a game country, why was it two such industrious hunters did not get a crack at something, whether a deer, a moose, or even a fox? Anything would have been welcome as a change from the monotony. Perhaps Giraffe would have been surprised if told that he and the puffing Bumpus made quite too much noise to prevent any wary and timid deer from staying within 1/4 of a mile of them. And also that often they were doing their hunting down the wind, so that their scent at such times was carried to the nostrils of the suspicious game long before the hunters came in sight. Finally they came across some partridges, and Bumpus managed to bag a couple with 2 shots from his new gun. He was greatly elated by the success attending his efforts, even though Giraffe did mention something about the birds insisting on remaining on the branch of that tree so long that they must either have been frozen there, or else wanted to commit suicide. "Well, they came to the right place then," said Bumpus sturdily, as he crammed new shells in his gun. "I'm the feller to help every partridge and deer pass over the divide that feels like going. Bring on your game. Now we're going some." But as the afternoon began to wane, they had a shot at nothing else, though once Giraffe became excited, and declared he had caught a glimpse of a deer making off in the distance. "Now ain't it a shame," he went on to say, "how that deer just knew we were comin'? Seems like somebody went ahead with a trumpet, and announced that 2 hunters were on the trail. After that they all hike out. But seems to me it's getting some cold right now, Bumpus. My fingers begin to tingle. Told you to wear the old mitt Step Hen offered you, but you sneered at the idea. I'm feeling pretty cold myself, considering that I'm on the move all the time. Say, where are we anyhow, and how far from the camp?" Giraffe looked blankly at Bumpus. "Here's the compass, and we can see which way is north all right. Then east is off that way on the right, south around yonder, and west here. But where in the dickens is that camp? South, north, or east? Honest, Bumpus, I don't know." "No more do I, Giraffe," replied the other. "And this makes me think of that Injun that got lost, and was found half starved by some white men. But he was too proud to admit his little shortcoming, so when they asked him if he hadn't kinder managed to get twisted in his bearings, he slaps his breast with his hand, and takes a pose like this, and says he, 'Injun not lost. Wigwam lost. Injun here.' And we're like that Injun, Giraffe. Oh, no, we're not lost one little bit, because we know we're here. But I just can't amble on any longer. Suppose we stop and camp. These partridges will taste prime. Yum, yum. Can't get at 'em too soon to please me. Get busy and light a fire, Giraffe. That's your part of the contract always." "I sure will if you give me a few matches, Bumpus," replied the other, wearily dropping his heavy rifle that began to feel like a ton of lead. "Matches? Why, you're the fire maker, and I thought you'd take care of that part of the business," exclaimed Bumpus, looking a little alarmed. "Why, what a silly you can be, Bumpus. Don't you know I promised Thad never to carry a single match around with me? And now look what a fix we're in, lost in the Maine woods with night coming on and getting colder every minute, and not a single match to start a fire with. I see our finish all right. When they find us some days from now, we'll be just frozen stiff, that's what." The two tenderfeet looked at each other, but there was no smile on either face now, for affairs had assumed too serious a phase to admit of merriment. Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Giraffe tries for the 14th time. "Whatever can we do, Giraffe?" asked Bumpus presently, after he had sighed several times in a most forlorn way. "Oh," remarked the other, making out to be little concerned about the matter, although his manner did not deceive the fat boy in the least, for he knew Giraffe was worried greatly. "There are lots of things we can do, all right, but you see the trouble is, Bumpus, they ain't a-going to help out much." "We're in a tough hole, all right," grunted the other, disconsolately. "Talk about Thad and Step Hen camping out," Giraffe went on to say. "Why, their troubles couldn't be mentioned in the same breath with ours, and you know it. They had a-plenty of matches along, and could get all the blaze they wanted. And say, think of having the best part of a fine young buck to cook," burst out Bumpus, with another groan. "As for us, we've got the game all right, but however can we get down to eating partridges that ain't ever even been near a fire?" "Quit talking of eating, Bumpus, you fairly set me wild," declared the tall boy, rubbing his empty stomach as though its calls were growing more insistent with the knowledge that they must pass unheeded now. "Then you must be hungry?" suggested Bumpus. "Hungry ain't no name for it," Giraffe replied. "That's always the way, I've been told. When there ain't no water, a feller feels as if his tongue was sticking to the roof of his mouth. And Bumpus, being hungry ain't the very worst of it, either." The fat boy sat up, and looked at his companion in misery, as though startled. "What you mean, Giraffe, by slinging that scare into me? I'd like to know what's worse than starving to death in a single night?" he demanded. "Oh, shucks! Don't you worry about that," the other went on, with a sneer. "Not so much chance of our coming to such an end in so short a time. But there is real danger around us, Bumpus." "Say, do you mean about them wolves?" exclaimed Bumpus, with a tremble in his voice. "That's just what I do mean," came the reply. "When they tackled our comrades, why, they were bold as anything, even if the boys did have a fire burning all the time. Think of how we're up against it, without a single match to start a blaze." "Then there's only one thing for us to do, Giraffe." "Suppose you tell me what that is?" demanded the tall scout. "Climb a tree," replied Bumpus, promptly. Giraffe made an impatient gesture. "Of course, we could do that as a last resort, Bumpus. But the chances are, if we did, we'd freeze before morning," he declared. "I've heard old hunters say that of all the agony they ever endured, being kept in a tree all night was the worst. Feel in your pockets again, Bumpus. Try everywhere, and see if you can only scare up one single match. If you did, we'd be mighty careful not to waste it, I tell you. This is a case of 'my kingdom for a match.'" So the fat scout commenced a systematic search.
Every single pocket did he feel in with trembling fingers, while his comrade watched his face anxiously, knowing that it was likely to indicate the success or failure of the search. When he saw a sudden grin come upon that broad countenance, Giraffe felt like bursting out into a yell of joy. "Got one, haven't you, Bumpus?" he exclaimed, eagerly. "That was a bully good idea of mine after all, you see, having you look again. Say, won't we be careful of that one precious match, though? And won't we have the fine dry stuff all ready to kindle as soon as I strike it? You must let me handle things, Bumpus, because you know I'm more used to. What's the matter with you? Don't tell me it ain't a match after all? Oh, thunder!" Bumpus had slowly drawn his hand out of his pocket, and held some object up between his forefinger and his thumb. It was about the length of a match, but had a sharpened point instead of a blunt head. A miserable toothpick that I just dropped into my pocket when we ate that dinner at the restaurant," groaned the wretched Bumpus, staring first at the offending object, and then turning a piteous face toward his comrade. Giraffe managed to rise to the occasion. Perhaps he remembered that Thad had really committed the other into his charge, and that it was to him the scoutmaster would look to give a good account of the expedition. And then again, Bumpus was so shocked by the series of calamities which had befallen them that he looked almost ready to collapse. So Giraffe drew himself up, and assumed a confidence that he was far from feeling. "Don't take on so, Bumpus," he went on to say, almost cheerily. "It may not be so very bad after all. Don't let's forget that we're scouts, and must keep a stiff upper lip whenever things turn out wrong. We'll just do the best we can, and I reckon it'll all come out right in the end. It nearly always does, you know." At least his words and manner had some effect on the almost exhausted fat boy, who brightened up more or less. "Now, that's nice of you talking that way, Giraffe," he said. "You're the right kind of a chum to have in time of trouble. But say, ain't it getting cold, though? Is that why you're slapping your arms around so?" "Try it, and see how quick you feel warmer, Bumpus," replied the other, with the patronizing air of one who is superior in knowledge, and willing to impart all he knows. "You see, the violent action starts the heart to beating nearly twice as fast as it does ordinarily, and that pumps the blood harder, so it gets to the very end of your extremities. That's what Thad says, anyhow, and it sure enough works." So for a minute or two both lads kept up a strenuous exercise, though it was too much for poor Bumpus, who presently stopped. "Feel better, don't you?" demanded Giraffe, imperiously. "A whole lot. But doing that has one bad point, I find," said Bumpus. "As how?" asked his companion. "Why, it keeps on making you all the hungrier. Exercise always has that effect on me. Why, Giraffe, I feel like I could eat a whole ham right now." "Didn't I tell you to let up on that style of talk? You're just making me groan inside every time you speak of eatin'. We ought to be trying our level best to better our condition." "But I don't know anything that would help us, Giraffe. So it's up to you to get us out of this ugly hole. Perhaps we might use a shell from my gun, and by taking out most of the powder, snap it off, and start a fire going." Strange to say, Giraffe did not seem to take to the idea, simple though it was, and later on commended by Thad and Allan, when they heard about the trouble. The fact was, Giraffe had suddenly remembered something. "You leave it to me, and see if I don't pull out a trick worth while," he remarked, mysteriously, and Bumpus saw him turn aside to get down on his knees. For some time the fat boy sat there, apparently lost in bitter reflections. Now and then he would give a start, and look around him hastily, after which he would heave a great sigh, or else groan dismally. From this it might be assumed that Bumpus was allowing himself to dwell upon many a glorious supper he had devoured in the company of his Boy Scout chums. And just when he was enjoying things the best he knew how, he would remember the desolation that confronted himself and Giraffe. Then he would pick up one of the 2 partridges that had fallen to his new Marlin 10-bore, look critically at it, feel the meat on the plump breast, and then shake his head, as though the idea of having to turn cannibal and devour the game raw did not appeal at all to him. On one occasion, when he aroused himself from this abstraction, he became conscious of a strange humming sound. "What you doing there, Giraffe?" he demanded, as the noise certainly proceeded from the spot where his chum was down on his hands and knees. "Why, you see," replied the other slowly, I fetched my little bow and fire-making outfit along with me, thinking I might have a chance to try a scheme I got in my head. I'm getting right into it now, because I want to start business before it's real plumb dark." But far from reassuring the dejected Bumpus, these words only made him grunt. Had he not watched Giraffe working away for dear life with that miserable little outfit a dozen times, and always with the same result, getting perilously near success, but always missing it by a hair's breadth? What chance did they have of securing the much desired fire, if all depended on Giraffe succeeding in inducing that twirling stick to generate enough heat to throw off a spark that would catch in the dry tinder? None at all. It was only a hollow mockery. Some smart scouts might be able to do the little trick, but up to now it had baffled the skill of Giraffe. Why, even Thad had lost pretty much all hope of his ever succeeding, Bumpus suspected, and believed that the only good thing about the tall scout's labors was his persistence. So, shaking his head again dolefully, Bumpus allowed himself to once more figure out a bill of fare that he would like to commence on, if he only had the good fortune to sit down at a table in a first-class restaurant. It seemed to give him untold satisfaction just to imagine the heaping platters that were being brought before him in rapid succession. Why, in his vivid imagination, he could almost get the delicious odors of the various dishes that had long been favorites with him, particularly the liver and bacon and fried onions. Oh, how tantalizing to suddenly arouse himself with a start, to look around at the rapidly darkening scene of those lonely pine woods, and hear, instead of the waiter's cheery voice, only that continual grinding sound, as the boy with the never give up nature kept sawing away with his miserable little bow; and the poor stick kept whirling back and forwards with a violent motion in the socket that held one end. In the estimation of Bumpus, that was coming down from the sublime to the ridiculous. He had little confidence in all this labor of Giraffe, though goodness knows that if ever success would prove a boon to a couple of stranded hunters caught in the darkness of a wintry night, with not a match in their possession, it was then. CHAPter 20.